Please welcome our next speaker, Chad Althaus, a solution architect, low-code digital transformation. Today, he will be presenting automation in the Dataverse. Please stick around after Chad's session for a live Q&A.
Hello everyone, welcome to my DynamicsCon session on low-code automation in the Dataverse. Thanks for joining. I am your host, Chad Althaus. I'll be walking you through some of the options for automation in the Dataverse without using code. I'm based in Houston, Texas. I'm a mechanical engineer turned solution architect in the Power Platform and Dynamics 365 customer engagement space. And I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me. I also have a personal blog. Check it out. It's still being built up. It came out during quarantine, so still work in progress. So love to connect with you. Note with this session, I'll be in the chat throughout, and I'm going to be available for Q&A at the end of my session. So please stick around, ask your questions as we go through, and I'm happy to address them at the end. So thanks for joining again, and let's go and jump in. So we're going to talk a little bit about overview on automation. Then we're going to walk it through some of the options we have for low-code process automation in the Dataverse. Then we're going to talk about classic workflows versus Power Automate, some of the examples of which one you should choose, and do a deep dive into Power Automate at the end of the last half of the session about. A note as we begin, terminology has changed. You've probably seen these messages for Microsoft. Dataverse is the new name for Common Data Service. They haven't updated everything. Entities are now tables. Fields are now columns. There's going to be a hybrid of both terminology throughout the session. So just know that. All right, so what is automation? I think that's the first thing we should ask when we're looking at this. And you can see the definition here from dictionary.com. It's really about removing human interaction in a process. And so that's kind of what we're going to focus on, reducing human intervention to a minimum. We want to do things, if we don't have to have people involved, we don't want to. It costs money and resources, frustration. So we want to fix that. We want to make things quicker, more efficient. Some reasons we might want to automate: eliminating mundane, repetitive tasks. If you've got the same thing you're doing day in and day out, and it's just click here, click there, send this email, we can automate those things. You want to make it easier for the users. That's going to increase your user adoption, right? You want to standardize processes. And so instead of telling users and relying on them to do step 1, step 2, step 3, if it's going to be the same every time, why don't we automate it? Just make it happen automatically. You can enforce business logic. You can improve data quality. You can have access to other data sources. And you can also improve communication by sending emails and that kind of thing. This list could go on forever, but those are some examples I could think of. A note for who I'm talking to in this presentation: I'm looking at Dynamics 365 folks. They're going to be the most familiar, the customer engagement apps, but it's much broader than that. The Dataverse is for all now. And so if you've got Power Platform at your company, then your citizen developers and makers can learn from this session in their personal productivity environment. IT application developers and Power App developers can use this in their enterprise Power Platform environments. And then, of course, Dynamics 365 CE folks, the analysts, architects, etc., will, of course, have relevance here as well. So the options for automation in the Dataverse, I've listed here a good number of the options, not exhaustive, but the kind of low-code process automation is at the top, and code first is at the bottom. I'm focusing in that top section: classic workflows, Power Automate, cloud flows. We also have the code first equivalent for these, or plugins, workflow extensions, custom APIs, which are in preview. I'm not a developer. I'm not talking about those. Just know there's other options that involve professional developers that you can do these things as well. Talking about low-code process automation, though, that's where our focus is. Classic workflows is where we start. And Dynamics 365 is where these came from. It's the legacy tool. And so I have that logo Dynamics 365, but it's not just for people in Dynamics 365. If you're in the Power Platform, you have access to these tools as well. So if you're working in the Dataverse, you can use Classic Workflows. Some notes about Classic Workflows. You create them from the Solution Explorer, the Classic, that button at the top of your window where it says Switch to Classic, that's where you have to go. They can occur in real time or background. And with the real-time workflows, we get some new functionality like triggering an action before an event occurs and rolling it back if an error happens. You can also create them on demand or as child workflows. They're fully solution aware. They can run as triggering user if they're set as real-time. You can store the run history for background workflows. They are all bound to tables in the Dataverse. So a workflow might be based on the contact table or the account table. And so that's where they start. They can only access data within the Dataverse, right? So you can't go to another data source from a Classic workflow. It's just contained in the Dataverse itself. This is what it looks like when you go to create a Classic workflow. Again, it's the old designer. The verbiage, the terminology is outdated. They're not going to update it. So you choose your entity, you choose whether you want background or real-time. And then once it comes up, we'll see this yellow banner across the top. It says, we recommend using Microsoft Flow. They haven't updated it. It probably will never say Power Automate. Click here to start building flows. So every time you're in a background workflow, it tells you, hey, go use Power Automate. That's the tool you should use. Some functionality we have on demand, child process. You have multiple triggers when a record is created, status changes, etc. Up at the top, you'll see that convert to real-time workflow. And so if we click that, now we have the same workflow, but it's real-time. And I have highlighted in the boxes what we have new with the real-time workflow. Instead of happening after an event occurs, you can happen before an event occurs. So before the status changes, let's make a change happen, or send an email, etc. And you can also execute as the user who made changes to the record. So those are two unique things that we see with the real-time workflow in the Classic setting. Custom actions are very similar to real-time workflows, but you also have, well, you don't have triggers for one. You have to call them from a workflow or Power Automate or code as well, but we're going to look at workflow or through Power Automate. You can do both. And then we have new addition of input and output parameters or arguments. I'll just show you what this looks like. Instead of creating a workflow, we select action. We select the entity or table we want it to be bound to, or we select none, and it's going to be an unbound action. A unique name is generated once you create this, and you have in that box in the middle, you have your input and output process arguments that you can define. I created an input argument as a message, a string type, and we're going to capture a message from the user and send that an email to the owner of the contact. That's what this action does. And we'll call this action a little bit later through Power Automate. I'll show you how that works. You can also enable rollback on custom actions. That's something as well. So we'll move over to Power Automate. That's Classic workflows, custom actions, now Power Automate. So this is Microsoft's baby. This is the new tool. This is what Microsoft wants you to use. And there's both cloud flows and desktop flows. I'm going to refer throughout the rest of the presentation just to cloud flows. The desktop are robotic process automation tasks, RPA, where you can access things on your desktop or in the web as well. And so another session is needed for that. Look it up if you don't know. Power Automate, only background flows. So cloud flows can only happen in the background, no real-time functionality allowed, okay? You can access hundreds of data sources across all sorts of systems. Most things that you can think of, you can access. And so that's a difference from the Classic workflows, right? Where you can only access the Dataverse itself. You have a bunch of new triggers. And so you've got built-in triggers. You've got a schedule. You can build a recurrence. That's new. If you want to trigger it as a button, you can have a button on your desk or in a Power App that you trigger flow from. You can use geofence as location. That's pretty neat as well. And you can send an HTTP request. You can connect from any Microsoft application, essentially, when a team message is generated or when a task is generated in Planner. Any of these things you can do, including even Salesforce. You can't stack multiple of these together. So if you want it to be available to run on demand and you want it to happen automatically when a record is generated, then you need 2 flows for that, at least. These are not bound to tables in the Dataverse, and they keep a 30-day run history. So we'll walk through what that looks like a little bit in the Dataverse, the full Dataverse, and then Dataverse for Teams. So we always start in the Power Apps Maker portal, and we go from a solution to create a new Cloudflow. We're going to give it a name, and then we're going to select the Common Data Service Current Environment Connector. We'll talk more about connectors in the second half of the presentation. And then it's going to create a connection reference with your credentials to connect to the Dataverse. We're going to select the change type. You can choose create or update, or delete, any combination of those. Choose the table, choose the scope. These are all very similar to the classic workflows. And then for purposes of this, I'll just pull some of the dynamic content, the full name or the first name, and put it in a compose step. You would typically use this to do some other process, obviously. Once you save that, the Cloudflow gets saved and added to your solution, and a connection reference will also be added to your solution, you'll see. And that is just another component that stores the credentials that you need to authenticate when you move to another environment. All right, creating a flow in Dataverse for Teams. You can do this. You can't do classic workflows in Dataverse for Teams, but you can create Power Automate flows, and everything we're talking about still applies, almost. So you can't access from the Maker portal on the web. You have to go through Teams through the Power Apps app. And we're going to go to See All, and we're going to create a new Cloudflow from the Build tab. You don't want to use the Common Data Service Classic connector. You only want to use the current environment one. The classic one is a premium connector in Dataverse for Teams, whereas the current environment is not a premium connector in Dataverse for Teams. So you only have access to the Dataverse for Teams environment itself. That's the trick. That's the caveat. So we can create everything just like we would for a normal Dataverse flow, and it gets added into the environment. So rather than working through a solution in our Power Apps Maker portal, we just do it directly through Teams. So talking about which workflow tool should I use, we're talking about classic workflows or Power Automate. We're going to have some trivia. If you want to engage in the chat, please feel free. I won't give you too much time, but see if you can guess as we go along. So showing updates on the form upon save, rolling back changes in case of failure, and triggering before an event occurs. I have these all grouped together because they're all parts of a real-time process. And if it's real-time, which do we need to use? It's classic workflow. Power Automate only supports background workflows or flows. If you want to create a recurring process, so you want to make it on a schedule happen every Sunday at 5 p.m. We've wanted this in the Dynamics world for a long time, never got it natively. Now we have it through Power Automate. If you want to get something from another data source outside the Dataverse, Power Automate. If you want to create and call a child process, so create a call a child workflow, create a call a child flow, either one works. Oops. And if you want to call a custom action, so you created that custom action at the beginning, right? We created that custom action to send the email to the contact owner, and we want to call that. So we can do that with either tool. If we want to trigger upon create, update, or delete, and we also want to make it available to run on demand, then we need the classic workflows. Power Automate won't allow us to do both of those at the same time. We need two different flows for that. If we want to create a process that runs as the triggering user, either one works, but if we want it to be a background process, we need Power Automate. To create a process within Dataverse for Teams, I had mentioned this just a minute ago, got to be Power Automate. And then as you work with these tools, you'll find Power Automate has some funny things that work with it. When you import flows from one environment to another, you sometimes have to reestablish connections and turn them back on. Classic workflows, you don't have any headaches. So it's just something to know. And then if you want to update all related records, so every contact that's related to a parent account, all the contacts, Dynamics in classic workflows, we couldn't do that. We always wanted to. You'd need other plugins, things like that to be written by developers. But Power Automate allows you to do that. So that is something huge that I love with Power Automate. And if you want to know Microsoft's answer, you probably guessed it. It's Power Automate, but you still need the classic workflows for real-time processes. So they haven't figured that one out yet. I don't know how they will, because I know they're going to deprecate classic workflows at some point. So as for now, we still need them. All right, so we're going to do a deep dive into Power Automate. We're going to talk about connectors, triggers, actions, tips, and some tools. So this might be a bit of a fire round. Just a note about before, I'm going to release a series of blog posts on my blog just to go a little bit more in detail on some of these, because I can't spend much time on them. So talking about connectors, we've got 3 available that you'll see. And Dynamics 365 is the first one they made. It's deprecated, don't use it. The Common Data Service was the next one, and it had a lot of improvements. It was neat. Then they created another one, Common Data Service Current Environment. For a while, they renamed this one to DataFlex until they changed that name. Now it's the Dataverse, but the connector hasn't been renamed yet. So just know that. We're going to look at the triggers for each of these different connectors, but not for Dynamics 365. It's deprecated. Don't use it. So if we search Common Data Service, we'll see 2 of them. We see both of them. If we want to compare what we have available in both of them, there's a lot of similarities. On the left, we have the current environment, and on the right, we have the classic one. So on the classic one, when a record is created, when a record is deleted and updated, those are all separate, right? And they are in one on the left. So we have some more functionality to be able to do in that. In the current environment, we can also execute that in a business process flow. So we can have a step in the business process flow to be to call a Power Automate flow. And then on the right, in the Common Data Service Classic connector, this is the only way that we can create an on-demand flow. So when a row is selected, that is an on-demand flow. When you do that, it's going to show up in the flow options of the ribbon or the command bar in your model-driven application. If we look at the options we have for the triggers in both, if we do on the left, when a row is added, modified, or deleted, on the right, just updated step, there's some similarities and some differences. On the right, you'll just notice the classic connector, you have to select the environment. This can be good or bad. And so you can get into trouble with that by mixing environments up. But maybe you have a use case for that. So if you do, you need that one. On the left, we have the change type. You have one trigger that you can do, create, update, or delete, or any combination. And then we can also filter based on the rows. We can delay the flow, and we can choose how we run the flow, whose credentials we run as. If we look in the actions, we have the current environment again on the left and the classic on the right. And everything in the classic connector we've got in the current environment. So just know that. We've got a bunch of new functionality and features in the current environment connector. The first is download a file or an image. So there's a new, last year, Microsoft released a file type of a column. or a field, and you can have a file on your contact table if you want a table for, or a field or column for that. This allows you to execute that, to download the file from that field or from that column. The next one is perform a bound action. So Microsoft has a lot of bound actions, and you can also access your custom bound actions. So that one we created earlier was a contact action, and so that would show up here, bound action. Unbound actions are not bound to any specific table, and you'll see there's a lot of power there, but you have to know a little bit about formatting JSONs and a little bit more technical formatting. I didn't know that. I've learned it. A lot of people have documentation on that on the internet. So if you need to figure out how to use that, Google it. You can probably figure out how to do that, but it's going to be a little bit more technical. You can use AI Builder to run models, run your data through models. You can create relationships. The current environment connector behaves a little bit differently. And so you have to use this step. Well, you can use this step to create relationships, but you can also use this for many-to-many relationships. And that's a huge benefit. You couldn't do that really natively before. It was pretty difficult. You needed code. You can also undo those changes, unrelated rows. You can upload a file, just like we could download, and perform a change set request. This is pretty neat. This allows you to create a bunch of actions together and then submit those changes to the Dataverse at once as a change set request, and the entire thing will succeed or fail at once. All right, we are moving into tips for Power Automate. So this is going to be a bit of a speed round, so bear with me. Again, I'm going to have some more detailed deep dives on these on my blog at some point, but this will get you going for now. The first tip I want to share with you is OData formatting. So if you're working in the current environment connector, you have to know what OData, you don't have to know what OData means, but you need to know kind of how it works. So whenever you set a lookup column, you have to set it with either the OData ID or define it using the pluralized logical name. Rather than just giving the GUID, the ID, you have to define the pluralized entity type around it with parentheses. So you can see that in that middle screenshot. Lookup columns have two parts, a type and a value. And so you can see at the bottom that system users is the owner ID type, and then the GUID is the owner ID value. And so in that middle screenshot, I'm using the owner value as the GUID to set the lookup field. Step number two, or tip number two, is to limit flow runs using filters. So use column filters and row filters, where on this example, we're filtering so the flow only triggers when the email address one changes value. We're also only triggering the flow when do not bulk email is not equal to true, which is 1, and so that's a Boolean field. So both of those things allow you to limit the number of flow runs, and that's very helpful. Just know you should do that. There's API limits and allocations that you have in your environment. Know it's best practice to limit flow runs when you can. Expand query is another neat one. It eliminates the need for additional get a row by ID steps. So if you want to get just one or two fields from a related, basically through a lookup column, you can do that in either a list rows or a get row by ID step. Here, I'm listing all opportunities with the state code equal to 0. That's active. And I'm expanding the query to pull the parent account ID. I'm getting the name, the parent contact ID, I'm getting the full name, and the owning user, I'm getting the full name and internal email address. So through that, I'm going to list opportunities, maybe get one, maybe 1,000 opportunities or more, and I'm going to get that information from the related from the parent account, contact, and owning user, all in one step. And so there's a lot of power in that as well. choose which credentials to use as step number 4 or tip 4. So select run as at the beginning. In that trigger step, choose the process owner, record owner, triggering user, and it's going to run the entire flow under that user's credentials. But be sure you check the use invoker's connection on every step that you want to use that. Otherwise, it'll use the connection that's defined on that step. So be sure you have both. Tip number 5, I learned this the hard way. If you're adding multiple filtering columns, never include a space. It won't register the second or third or fourth column listed if you have a space. Microsoft support even told me, oh, it just only does the first one, but they couldn't figure out that I just had a space. So space breaks it. Don't do that. And then tip number 6 is to set many-to-many relationships. So this allows you to set I have, in this example, a custom entity or table called business partner, and I'm relating that to account. It's a many-to-many relationship. You couldn't set a many-to-many relationship before without using code. And so this is pretty neat. You can relate many-to-many relationships and unrelate many-to-many relationships. So take advantage of that. I use that also for connectors. You can do that, connections rather. So connecting a contact to an opportunity, that kind of thing. Tip number 7, you can't update with the current environment connector using null value. What I mean by that, in this example, I'm updating an existing contact with a city from a previous step. If that city value from the previous step is null, the flow run will fail. It can't update with a null value. The current environment connector can't. If you want to do that, if you need to do that, then what you have to do is tip number 8, combine the CDS and current environment connectors. And just to go back, what I mean with that is you'd have the trigger would be the current environment, and the update would be the classic connector, the CDS. And by doing that, you can pass a null value and it won't fail. So with combining CDS and the current environment connector, both, you can do things as in this example. I have the trigger is the classic connector and the action is the current environment. Beware, always select the environment as default. Otherwise, you're going to get environments crisscrossed when you promote the flow from one environment to another. So always select default environment. Otherwise, you're going to have issues. But in this example, I'm doing tip number 9. I'm actually calling a custom action through Power Automate. And so I created this action on the left, the email contact owner. Now I'm going to perform a bound action, and it's going to be that CAA email contact owner. So I found that on the contacts table in Power Automate. I'm going to pass the input from the Power Automate trigger as the parameter for this action. And so you can see on the left, that process argument for message, I'm populating over on the right in the perform a bound action step. So that just allows you to really extend things a lot. And maybe you already have actions built up. There are some things that are easier to do in actions than they are in Power Automate. And so by doing this, you can really leverage the best of both worlds. I like this solution a lot. So I wanted to address some helpful tools at the end. So we've got Fetch XML Builder and Level Up for Dynamics 365 and Power Apps. And I'll talk just a bit about both of these. Fetch XML, it's in the XRM toolbox. A lot of letters. So you can build your Fetch XML. You can actually use the Fetch XML as your trigger or as the filter for a list rows step. So that's helpful in itself. You can also, what I like to do is go to Power Automate parameters in the view step and then get the filter query or the order by or the expand query. So it formats all of that, so you don't have to figure out how to do it. They've got very unique ways that you have to format things with the OData notation. And rather than learning that, which I have done, you can save yourself that time and headache and just use this tool. It's extremely helpful. Thank you, Jonas, for building this, and I hope that you're recovering well. He has been done so much for the community. So this is a fantastic tool. The next tool is Level Up for Dynamics and Power Apps. And this is in Chrome. This is an extension anyone can download, and it's dangerous. We don't want users to know about this because it's got a thing called God mode on the left. This one will reveal all hidden fields and remove all client-side logic on the form in a model-driven app. It's very helpful for admins. It's very dangerous for users. We don't want them to know about it, but for us, it's fantastic. So I wouldn't do my job without it. You can also click logical names. It will show you the schema name or the logical name for every field or column on your model-driven form. So if you see, like, oh, we changed the name for that column. What is the real column? Like, we changed customer ID to say contact, maybe. You can click that and it'll show you what it really meant. And then all fields is one that I use daily. And from within the record, within the context of a record in Dynamics or Power Apps or model-driven app, you can select all fields. It'll show you every field or column that's defined on that table and what the value is. And this is so helpful for checking fields that you don't have on the form, for seeing how lookup columns are defined. So here I've got the owner ID value. I showed you before, every lookup column has a value and a type. And so the value is the GUID that, well, it's logical lookup name, but this is the type, it's system user. And so the type is system user, the value is the GUID, and this is what it actually looks like. And so level up, install it. Hopefully you won't make anybody happy by doing that. Use it wisely. With great power comes great responsibility. So please be careful. There's so much more. We could have a session on this tool entirely. It's extremely powerful. And that is the end of my session. I try to keep things somewhat brief, try not to go too in depth with anything, but hopefully you learned a lot. And well, thanks everyone for joining my DynamicsCon session, and thanks to DynamicsCon for hosting this great conference. As we leave, we'll transition to time of Q&A. And after the session, please connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, check out my blog. I'll have some new posts coming up going in detail here. And just again, thanks to DynamicsCon for everything you've done for this great conference.
Hey, Chad. That was a really great session, and there were a lot of questions and conversation going on happening in the chat window.
I know. We got a lot of big people here.
Yeah, so it was a really good and interesting session indeed. And okay, I just read out the questions to you, so it's easier for you to
thank you.
Answer without focusing on that. One of the questions that I saw is, can you connect Power Automate to the on-prem Dynamics 365, the CE environment?
And I don't actually know the answer to that. So I haven't worked on-prem at all myself. So I don't know. Maybe somebody in the chat? No?
Yeah, I don't think it is possible at the moment with any of the CDS connectors. Probably we'll have to use the SQL connector and
using
the
you can probably
gateway
hack your way into it.
Yeah, SQL. So it's not a really just probably might be good for read only, but probably not for create or update, delete.
For
And
integration would suck. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. People are always also interested in
RPA.
how your background, how if you jump from the engineering background to this Dynamics 365 CE or a popular platform
Yeah.
consultant.
Yeah. So good question. So it seems like so many people in this space have been transplanted from other totally different professions. And so I was in working in operations at a manufacturing company and knew I never wanted to be a true engineer. Just in school, I kind of realized, I'm good at this stuff, but I don't enjoy it. And then when things, I was doing a lot of shadow IT kinds of things. So I was doing a lot of process automations and building macros to automate report building in Excel and things like that. And I had enough tickets open with IT that they recruited me to join IT to solve my own tickets. And basically, I joined IT and they're like, all right, here's 5 of your own tickets to solve. And then after a year or two, I was working as a business analyst with .NET applications we were building in-house for internal use. And then our CIO offered me, he was like, hey, we need somebody to help with the CRM support. Would you be interested in doing that? And so we had a full-time contract developer that was supporting the CRM, and there's nobody to help triage the requests. And so I came in as a BA to work between the business and the developer to give him, hey, we need to fix this, that kind of thing. And I didn't know anything going into that. And then fast forward a couple years, we've re-architected things, so we don't have support very much, and we don't have him. And I'm growing a team internally to try to do bigger and greater things. And so we're just doing CRM, and now we've got a lot more. We've got Power Platform solutions, and we're working with the business to build a lot more. And it was really, opportunity to work with the support, and then I saw the potential and saw what the community was doing and what the platform is capable of, and so we're trying to grow it from there. So it's been fun. I'm grateful for the opportunities, and I have found my calling.
Nice. Really interesting story.
Yeah.
Okay. That's the next question is what have you talked about with your teams when it comes to the Power Automate governance? That is like making maker citizen developers, creating flows over time, or like considering API threshold and noise enable throttling, etc.
Good question, and I'm working on that right now. So most of the big flows have all been built by IT right now, and we're working on this year. I have on my agenda to install the Center of Excellence that Microsoft provides, or the starter kit, and develop a true Center of Excellence to get an idea of really what's going on and get a better picture, and they're getting better reporting with the number of API calls and things like that going on. So right now, from a total reporting and everything perspective, we're a bit Wild West and just trusting it right now, that we're not going over and breaking anything. But we check the analytics in the Power Platform admin center for failed flow runs, and we try to build. Now, the flows I built at first don't have this. I need to go back and update, but try to build in error handling to the flows. So when a step fails, then we send an email to a group to notify that the flow failed, at least the ones that are the most important. And so trying to build an error handling like that. I know Josh Cook, I think it is, has some great content on error handling, and so I'm trying to adopt some of his best practices to know when things are failing and to be able to take action when that happens. Because if you trust the native error handling in Power Automate, it'll be 5 days before you find out it failed. And none of my flows are built with my own connection as the owner anyway, so I don't even see those emails. So building in things like that is one of the biggest things I can suggest.
Nice. Yeah, people are in the conversation. They're talking about how they love Microsoft name changes, and they are also can't wait to see like the Power Automate to run in the synchronous mode to replace the real-time workflows. And talking about that, how do you think about Microsoft? Like, when do you think they would deprecate the background workflows in
Yeah,
favor of the Power Automate?
background workflows. I'm so curious. I think talking with Matt a little bit in the chat, we really are waiting for them to. I don't think they're going to deprecate background workflows until real-time workflows have been replaced in Power Automate, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. I know with Microsoft's brand vision, we can see that Power Automate is clearly going to take over, and everything that we've got built with classic workflows will have to be ported over to Power Automate, but that can't happen for years. I'd say from my perspective, making Power Automate function synchronously and then giving people time to port everything over. So I think right now it's good to be thinking about when we're building processes, do they need to be real time or can they be background? If they can be background, building them in Power Automate. Now, I still, for some simple things, people have, that's what Microsoft says, but it's still easier sometimes to build the background workflows with the classic designer rather than Power Automate because it's simpler to do some of the things. And but it's good to be doing as much as you can with Power Automate because at some point in the future, unknown number of years, Microsoft is going to tell us that's what we need to do.
Yeah. So like if I have my project, existing project that we built with 2-3 years ago, and they have the background workflows, do you think we should convert them to the Power Automate, or should we wait for the deprecation announcement?
I'm not personally. I'm leaving the background workflows, and truthfully, there some of the things that sometimes things work more quickly with the classic workflows. Just with the SDK, it's more native, and I like that for some things. And Power Automate has some clunkiness to it, and there's some growing pains with Power Automate with connections becoming connection references and promoting them between environments. And there's some issues that we've had with Power Automate with things like that. Another thing is if you have infrequent workflows or infrequent processes, if a Power Automate if the Power Automate flow isn't triggered with, what is it? Is it 3 months? Then they turn it off. And so there are different considerations like that. And the platform is continuing to change. So I'm not going through and reproducing all of my background workflows in Power Automate because there are too many changes, and I think they're too far out from deprecation. But other people would have a different perspective and say we were going through and doing that. I know they are, but personally, I'm not.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. So we need an extra license to run Power Automate to interact with the Dataverse?
So thankfully, you don't need a standalone Power Automate license. If you already have access to the Dataverse, then you've got a license that gives you access to the Dataverse, which gives you access to use Power Automate within the context of the Dataverse. So it won't give you access. I don't know how they're enforcing it. I haven't truly run into issues with it, but the licensing guide says basically if you're touching the Dataverse, then you're good with the flows. But if you're building flows that are just standalone for personal use or entirely separate applications that are outside of Office 365 connectors, because those are also included as well, then technically they're not included in the licensing. But interacting the Dataverse, you're good with whatever license you've got.
Yeah.
At least as of now. Things change.
Okay. Yeah. I'm checking the chat window. The conversations keep going, but that's all I see in the questions. Do you also see any other questions or anything that you would like to talk to the audience?
Let's see. Matt, you said you presented what last Friday? How low code is low code. Okay. Let's see. Let's see. I'm curious if anybody in here has worked on building flows and Dataverse for teams. I'm curious if anybody has.
Do you know any limitation about it? No, when
with Dataverse for teams, yeah.
Yeah.
So, like I said in the session, Dataverse for teams. So I haven't done an extensive amount in Dataverse for teams, but I played around enough to know some of the things. And the classic workflows you can't do. So real-time workflows you can't do. With Power Automate, like I mentioned, you have to use the current environment connector for CDS because otherwise it would give you access to other environments. And the nature of Dataverse for teams is that you're restricted to the environment you're in currently, which is that Dataverse environment in the team. Or I guess that Dataverse for teams environment. So you've got limitations with that. And so the current environment connector doesn't have the when a record is selected. That's one of the things that you can't do in Dataverse for teams then. And so if you build an app with that, you can't have the when a record is selected on demand basically. And then you've got all the other limitations that come with Dataverse for teams. Accessing other premium connectors requires additional licenses and has issues with that. So the main thing is not being able to use the classic CDS connector and accessing the other environments or anything like that. So, and then the way that you build them, you have to build them from Power Apps. So the whole Dataverse for teams, you're in Power Apps within Teams, and you have to go in there and find your environment and then build a flow from there, which is a neat experience. It's basically the same thing, just within Teams, but you can't just go to the web browser and go flow.microsoft or make.power apps and access those things.
Okay. One question came in. Do you see Bob platform encroaching on webhooks, Azure functions, and logic apps, etc.? So that is like low code displacing pro code.
I will recommend you attend. I forget what his name is. Tomorrow morning, I think it's tomorrow morning. He's got plugins versus workflows versus webhooks versus APIs, and I recommend going there because I'm not as technical, so I can't fully speak to that. I know there are things that you can do with code that you can't do no code, low code right now, and there's different performance considerations with that, and things that I don't know as much on. So, Lynn, can you speak to that more?
No, not actually. I came from developer background, but I haven't touched to that the other part of the Azure.
But not the CE developer.
Yeah, more like that. Yeah,
it is encroaching though for sure. I mean, Logic Apps was built for the developers, and now we have access to basically to the same thing through Power Automate, and so they're definitely encroaching. But then there are people that will say, well, your Power Automate flows should then become Logic Apps once you get to a certain point. And so there are different considerations like that. But so I definitely think that they're encroaching, but they're also continuing to be a valid thing. And then with the custom APIs, that's another thing coming up. And I guess I think that's going to be a low code way to create APIs. So I definitely think they're trying to make more and more possible low code.
Okay, so within the low code, it's in developer world. Are they like interactive?
I just haven't done it right. You can still edit your Dataverse for Teams flows in flow.microsoft, so that is good. I just wasn't looking at the right place, I guess.
Yeah.
And Heidi put in the chat plugins versus flow versus Azure Function versus web jobs tomorrow at 10. So thanks, Heidi.
So can the Power Automate desktop, can it be used to interact with our Dataverse environment?
Yeah, so that was one thing. Was it Adam? Somebody mentioned RPA earlier. And that is a great way that you can access other data sets and interact with the Dataverse. And so you can take your on-premise applications that you've got, your desktop applications, and you could interact with those with the Dataverse. And so using Power Automate Desktop, you can use Cloud Flows and Desktop Flows in Harmony to retrieve data from legacy applications and put them in the Dataverse, or you can go the opposite direction and take information from the Dataverse and put them in legacy applications, or maybe they're not legacy applications and you just need them on-prem for one reason or another. And so I think that's a neat opportunity to be able to access things that you couldn't before.
Okay. So like as mentioned in your session, like where can we learn more about like bound and unbound, those kind of actions?
Yeah, using Power Automate with bound and unbound actions. I will just do I'd say a shameless plug, but I'm going to plug Lynn's blog. He's got some great content around bound and unbound actions and how to format things for that. I've got a little bit. It's going to increase, but Lynn's got a wealth of content around that. Microsoft Docs, I typically would recommend, but they're pretty poor if you want to look at how to use unbound actions. They really don't give you much help unless you go to the developer documentation. There's sometimes some somewhat helpful things in that. But I'm going to plug you go to Lynn's blog. So
thank you.
That.
I'll leave in the chat window. I hijacked your session and shameless promote my blog.
So, and there you go. It's in the chat. So there's so much, and it's so confusing how Microsoft. I'm glad they give us functionality before they have the time to write all the documentation, but it's quite frustrating that they haven't got documentation up to what's available, and they're continuing to make improvements on what's out there. I've seen some of the unbound actions be replaced by new unbound actions that have better formatting, and they still no documentation for the old or the new, and that's quite frustrating. They have some more generic on the developer side, and I guess if you're a developer, maybe it's easy, but I'm not a developer, so I didn't even know what a JSON was before I started using Power Automate. And so, it's been fun making us all functional people, but a little bit more technical. But, well, if that's it, then we will go ahead and wrap. Thanks, everybody, for joining. This has been fun. I appreciate all the engagement. And Matt says they confuse it more by bringing out custom API. I know. I want to know more about that, but I haven't tried yet. That'll be more fun. But thanks for joining, everyone. And Lynn, were you going to say anything?
No, it's all good.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you all, and I thank you for supporting me and for coming to my session. So we'll see you around, and stick around for all the great sessions. I know the hosts of the Dynamics Hot Dish podcast have a great session on new sales features coming up next. So stick around for that.